There's a lot of Chinese-based sayings in Mexico, aren't there?
Está en chino. It's in
That's
Chinese.
one. Un cuento chino, a Chinese story.
Chinese
I
tale,
mean,
yeah.
there's a bunch, and sadly, unfortunately, a lot of them with a very racist background, which leads us nicely into the history of China in Mexico and the fraught relations that both countries have had. I think, weirdly, arguably, right now that the Mexico-China relationship is in everyone's mind, Mexico and China are probably the least conflictive or least problematic moment in their histories, and it's still not easy going.
I think in recent years, Sino-Mexican relations have grown quite significantly. I think most Mexicans would think they're growing from almost nothing. But when you look at the history, as you say, there's quite a bit of history there. I mean, it's not the history with the United States, of course, but there is a long-standing history between the two countries.
Or maybe there is a close history of triangulation between the US and China. We'll get into that in a sec. But the context of this, why would we think of talking about this today? I think everyone knows, right? The US fears around China have spilt over the border into Mexico, namely the fact that particularly American conspiracy theorists, I'd say, but also I think more serious people, have a latent fear that China will use Mexico as a backdoor for influence and trade. So, as we all know, the US has basically blocked on the basis of national security, so not tariffs, but rather you can't put a Chinese car into the US, not because it's too expensive, but because it has Chinese tech and therefore is not allowed in the US. But in Mexico, a lot of these bits of tech are allowed. So you've got Huawei, you've got BYD, and so there's this fear in the US that Chinese are importing into Mexico, slapping a "Made in Mexico" label, and then sending it into the US. We'll talk about whether or not this is true later on, but this is the context in which we exist right now. We've got the Mexico-Chinese-US relationship, which really colors the way that Mexico and China have to deal with each other. But I think that kind of ignores the bilateral relationship, which I think is perhaps even more complicated and more interesting than just seeing everything through the US prism. You've got the fact that Mexican and Chinese trade right now are a massive deal. Mexico has a much bigger trade deficit with China than the US does. Not in absolute terms, but in terms of the percentages. And that's because Mexico hasn't been as hard with Chinese imports. And so you've got Chinese cars that even now, with 50% tariffs from the Mexican government, we'll go into why that happened later, their market share went from 0 in 2022, so that's less than 4 years ago, to 10% of market share of Mexico's entire auto sector. Nothing, no time, massive growth. But I would say it's in the small cities that one sees Chinese influence the most. Sure, you get big Chinese tech hubs here in Mexico City or industrial hubs up in Nuevo León, but really it's when one drives through Perote in Veracruz or Amecameca in the rural part of Mexico, the state of Mexico, where one really sees Chinese influence. It's always the same. You drive into the city center after sort of a long dusty road into town, and you'll see a massive, ugly warehouse that'll say something like Chinese products. And it's now a new staple for these small towns where they bring in from China massive amounts of cheap plastic and textile goods to sell in the central square of these cities. And there'll always be a middle-aged Chinese man with his tummy out, smoking a cigarette. And that is a common sight that didn't exist in Mexico until maybe 5 to 10 years ago. And it's fascinating to show how plus ça change, right? Chinese presence in Mexico today looks a lot like Chinese presence in Mexico from the earliest days of that relationship, the 19th and early 20th century.
Yes, that change has been extraordinary to see. And I haven't really been back to Mexico in the most recent years, but already back in 2019, you would see way more Chinese people walking around in Mexico City that you would have seen ever before. And that has only grown. But as you say, this all dates back to the 19th century. And in an echo of what we're seeing today with a massive geopolitical sort of reordering of the world was also facing that massive reorganization in the 19th century, and China was a major victim of it. And it's in that context that Chinese-Mexico relations really flourish in the 1870s through to the late 1890s. China's basically going through a terrible time, what they call today, very dramatically, the 100-year humiliation of basically the British and to a degree the Americans, but mostly the British, doing what they wanted with the country. And this great...
Isn't it everyone, though? Isn't it the Russians, the Germans?
That's
the fact
true.
that we've got this lovely Tsingtao beer is because that part of China was occupied by the Germans.
You're 100% right. That was unfair to single out the Americans as the additional ones that were doing. It was everyone in Europe who was having a go at the poor Chinese. And it's also a time in which, possibly the greatest empire, that is still a great empire into the modern era, just falls apart in the process of 100 years, in the context also of having a massive population already since then. And that leads to huge numbers of people leaving China. China having to reimagine how it does things, but also what it's going to do with all this additional population that it has and its declining wealth. And in that context, a growing number of Chinese people begin to make their way to Mexico. And it is also in that context that in 1899, there's a treaty of amity and commerce signed for the first time between the Mexican Republic and back then Imperial China, but with China in general.
A brief parenthesis. A lot of people will say, this is way too late in the relationship. Actually, Mexico and China have a relationship even before Mexico was independent. That just tells me that you haven't been listening to the whole of Mexico, the podcast, because we've actually discussed this relationship, the colonial relationship between Mexico and China, in a previous episode, which we'll link in the show notes. But just briefly, it's the relationship between Mexican silver and the reconfiguration of the world economy because of the massive demand that the Qing dynasty had for silver overnight when they decided to start charging their taxes in silver money rather than in kind. And that changed the world economy, and China and Mexico were at the center of that change. But more on that in a different podcast. Carry on, Tavo.
And this relationship that China and Mexico have that really begins to flourish in the late 19th century continues to flourish under the rest of the Porfiriato. As we've talked about in the past, the Porfiriato is the time during which Porfirio Diaz governs Mexico as a dictator from the 1870s through to 1910, ultimately overthrown by the Mexican Revolution. And in this time, Diaz and his ministers have good use for the growing number of Chinese immigrants that are coming to Mexico, because it is during his presidency that a significant number of major infrastructure projects are taken on by the Mexican government. So Diaz is happy to have these Chinese immigrants who are happy to do jobs that many other people did not want to do, such as build the railways, as it happened as well in the US. The problem with this is, one, a sad reality of Mexico is Mexico's always been quite racist for historical reasons mostly, but that racism has always been there. And adding to that is the fact that people, by the end of the Diaz regime, really did not like Porfirio Diaz's regime. So people who were associated with Diaz and his infrastructure projects and, sort of being his workforce were not seen very positively.
Now, as you well say, there's historical reasons behind this racism. A lot of it imported from Western countries, right? The fact that they'd gone in and ravaged China during that century filled them up with a bunch of prejudices and just racism against the Chinese. This obviously was shared by the US, leading to the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which stopped all Chinese migration, all these Chinese people going in to build the railways. Well, they said, that's enough. No Chinese coming into the US for the next 10 years, they said. And that had direct repercussions on Mexico because a lot of the Chinese who were arriving ended up staying in Mexico. And they ended up carrying on that work, that railway work, which was also pouring into Mexico. A lot of these big rail tycoons had actually run out of space when it came to the US in that massive rail boom. And so they decided to expand their investments into the South, into Mexico. And a lot of those same Chinese laborers worked as they did in the US in Mexico. But of course, those prejudices and the sudden influx of these strangers from abroad were very much linked with Porfirio Diaz, who was known increasingly to at least seem to benefit foreigners more than local Mexicans.
We've talked about this in the past, but that border between Mexico and the US has always been incredibly porous. Wall or no wall, people cross that border back and forth. And not only is it in the 1880s, but as other anti-Chinese policies and attitudes grow within the United States, that leads a lot of people who had settled in the US to slowly make their way south into Mexico, be it to work on the railway or be it to just settle down.
It's the reason why the best Chinese food in Mexico can be found in the border town of Mexicali.
Which is something I found incredibly surprising because I didn't know this. Okay, I've never been to Mexicali, and I've never had food from Mexicali. But I remember being in South Australia of all places, in Adelaide, and I went to a restaurant that said Mexican food. And I was there, incidentally, with someone from Baja California. And I walk in general, Mexican food in Australia means like burritos and other not particularly Mexican things. So I walk in there, and it all looks like semi-Chinese. And I immediately say, this is so racist, so ignorant. Obviously, they have no idea. And then this guy who I'm with goes, you're completely wrong. This is traditional Mexicali food. It's Chinese Mexican fusion because there's a ton of Chinese immigrants in Mexicali. Exactly. I felt like just A, astounded, and then B, incredibly ignorant that I had no idea about this. And the food was delicious, by the way.
Yeah, and then number 3, sick after filling yourself with enormous amounts of Chinese food, Mexican Chinese food.
And today we still see the influence of the Chinese diaspora in Mexicali. That food is still there and that diaspora is still there. However, before the 1920s, there were other sort of groupings of that diaspora all across Mexico, and particularly the north of the country. This was partially the product of these infrastructure projects, partially the product of the porous border and people coming down from the United States. But it was also the product of a very deliberate policy that was coming from China itself. There was a minister of Imperial China who at one point is coming up with ideas of what could be done with the excess population that they had. And they said, basically, we should export Chinese people, essentially. So he started traveling through different parts of the Americas, trying to, come up with treaties and agreements, more broadly speaking, with the different governments of the Americas to see whether they could allow for some emigration to occur. And these led to what some people see as sort of test towns, basically, where Chinese people could settle down. Mexico was one of the places with whom there was some form of an agreement of this sort. The only condition that the Mexican government gave was if they're to come, they should go to the north because it's vast, there's no population there, it's a desert, nobody wants to live there, and we need to do something with it. So if you want to come, you should go up there. And this led to a variety of towns being built all over the north of the country, mostly populated by Chinese immigrants.
Now, one would wonder, if there was such an influx of Chinese people into the north, why aren't there as many people of Chinese descent as one might expect? And this is, I guess, where it gets a bit dark.
Incredibly dark. We spoke recently in another podcast about things that make you very proud to be Mexican. Well, this goes into the chapter of things that make you very not proud to be Mexican. Because in 1911, there was the infamous Torreon massacre, so called because of a massacre that happened in Torreon, in the northern state of Coahuila, where upwards of 300 Chinese people, including women and children, were massacred by revolutionary forces. Now, this wasn't just, in the tumult that is war, some accident occurring. This was a very deliberate, racist, and violent act carried out against the Chinese population of Torreon for a variety of reasons, be it racism, being the fact that they saw them to be associated with Porfirio Diaz, who had been overthrown by the revolution. Partially also that they were becoming economically very successful. The reality is the Chinese who arrived in these desert towns we're particularly entrepreneurial people. Not many people are happy to go and move into the middle of the desert in a country that they'd never heard of. And the people who do tend to be incredibly entrepreneurial. And so they became quite wealthy, filling up economic niches that were appearing in a modernizing country. And that led the locals to really not like them.
And so the Torreon massacre has the ignoble title of being the first ethnic cleansing of the 20th century, taking place here in Mexico and taking place across the country. It was systematized in Torreon, but as you say, Tavo, because of their economic success, because of the fact that they were in the middle of this nationalist, quite xenophobic revolution in Mexico, the Spanish merchants also got a lot of harassment from the revolutionaries, and the Chinese, because they were ethnically different, they were very clear targets. And so across the country, anti-Chinese violence took place, but none as violent and as concerted as in the city of Torreon.
And it's part of a much broader movement that happens. It's not just 1 year or 2 years during the revolution when this happens. We see massive protests against Chinese immigration. We see violence in different forms and levels, but violence against Chinese immigration all over the country, and particularly in the north, where there were more Chinese people, ultimately leading, very sadly, to the annulment of that treaty that had been signed in 1899, and B, the mass, eventually, deportation of Chinese people. Mexican Chinese people, in many instances. These are people who had been, by this point, born in Mexico, to Chinese parents, of course. And the people who remain, because not everyone is deported, are forced into the places where there was a larger and more powerful diaspora that could afford them some protection, such as Mexicali and Mexico City. And as I said, this continues during the 1920s. The United States continues to have anti-Chinese policies, but then you also get prohibition. So a ton of Chinese people make their way down to places like Mexicali. And with prohibition, so do a lot of Americans to come gamble and party. And that allows the Chinese diaspora there to continue to thrive. So it's not all bad news for the Chinese immigrants. However, by 1937, Lázaro Cárdenas, who basically creates the PRI, this is the party that held power for 70 years uninterruptedly in a semi-dictatorship. He is also the president who nationalizes oil for Mexico. And as a final blow to the Chinese-Mexico community, he also nationalizes a significant chunk of foreign land holdings, including Chinese foreign land holdings, which leads a lot of Chinese people to being impoverished, and it leads to a lot of Chinese people also being forced to leave the country. This, coupled with the mass deportations that had been occurring and continue to occur, leads to the creation of a Sino-Mexican diaspora back in China. So this I don't know if you knew this, Alex, but I found this really interesting. There's apparently, during the 1940s and 50s, a relatively substantial population of Chinese Mexican people who've been deported or forced out of the country in some way, living in the likes of Macau and other cities that are, in this case, on the southeastern coast of China. They're terribly impoverished. There's apparently, in some parts of China, there was at the time a saying, which was calling someone being a Mexican. Do you have any idea what that meant?
No.
So apparently being a Mexican, so the racist sayings come both ways. Being a Mexican meant being poor and stateless, basically, because they were referring to these people who look Chinese, but not quite fully Chinese. And they were very proud of their Mexican heritage for reasons I'll get to in a second. But in many parts of Southeast China, being a Mexican meant being very poor and just having a bad time.
Maybe that's the common factor of the human experience, terrible xenophobic phrases. Because as we mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, one of these, I guess they're from the Porfirian age when people hated the Chinese for being successful. Un cuento chino, a Chinese tale, is basically, I don't think people think of it this way because it is still a used term, but it basically means it's a lie. It's something that someone would tell you to deceive you.
Well, that's not very nice. I didn't know that was the original meaning. I always thought it was more like making something up, but like in the same way that a child might make up a story, not like an all-out lie.
That's worse. That's racist and condescending.
Fair. Going back to this sort of the pride that these Mexican Chinese people had about being Mexican, this I found also very interesting. Apparently, when these Chinese Mexican people are forced back to China, they get there and they really don't fit in. There's cultural norms that are very, very different. A lot of these people had been born and grown up in Mexico by this point. So they get there and they don't like China. They don't want anything to do with it. And right around this time, the Japanese take it upon themselves to conquer China. It leads to the horrible actions of the Japanese Empire. And these Mexican Chinese people found it really important to say to the Japanese, look, I am not Chinese, I am Mexican. Your quarrel is not with me. So a sort of Mexican identity amongst this diaspora who'd been treated horribly by the Mexican government and Mexican people really begins to grow. And I think it's here that Sino-Mexican relations begin to change, or this is the seed for that change that is to come. Because in the 1950s, this really begins to change with the actions, or thanks to the actions, of a group of sort of middle class, upper bourgeoisie kind of individuals, very much like the Rotary Club, but it has a different name. And amongst them, there are some Chinese business people from Mexico City who are pushing for the repatriation of these Mexican Chinese individuals who'd been very loud also on their side, trying to demand to be allowed back into the country. And also this happened in the context of the Cold War, right? So China's becoming communist, and they're kind of saying that we need to save our Mexican brethren who we treated horribly. We need to save them from the evils of communism. So by the late 1950s and early 1960s, there's a substantial repatriation of these Mexican Chinese people who had been deported or pushed out of the country in the previous decades. And this sort of sentiment is still there, and more people are coming back from China, and they're settling down overwhelmingly in Mexico City and Mexicali, but they are coming back to the country. And I think it's 1972 where we have like a very clear marker of a change in the relationship, because under the government of President Luis Echeverria, in 1972, Mexico becomes one of the first Latin American nations to recognize the People's Republic of China. The People's Republic of China has been a thing for a while at this time, but no one wants to recognize them because of the Cold War and communism and so on. But in 1972, Echeverria takes the leap and recognizes them. And this leads to a really interesting point. How many presidents do you think, Alex, from Echeverria till this day, Mexican presidents have visited China as a state visit?
No idea.
Absolutely all of them, except AMLO, who did no state visits.
Amazing.
And in the other direction, most of the premiers and presidents, sometimes it was premier, sometimes it was president, of the People's Republic of China have in turn visited Mexico, including Xi Jinping, who was in Mexico in 2013.
This is an interesting point in which I think the US-Mexico-China triangulation comes back, because it was important that it was Luis Echeverria, 1970s pro-Third World president, who did this recognition of the PRC, because I think it had a lot to do with how these two countries felt regarding the United States. This is the time, more or less, when also the United States is coming closer to China to drive a wedge between the USSR and the Chinese Communist government. Also, Mexico is playing this two ways. They don't want to be part of the United States sphere of influence, or they don't want to be subservient to the United States, but they also don't want to show themselves to be an antagonist to them. And so what they do is, and so it makes sense for these two governments who are sandwiched between these great power conflicts to come together under this banner of third world ideology. Again, we've discussed this in a previous podcast, very much talking about Luis Echeverria, so I'll tag that in the show notes. But this third world ideology, I think, is crucial to understand this closeness between the Mexican government and the Chinese government during these middle and latter years of the Cold War.
Also, the backstory on the Chinese side as well is that China begins to grow and begins to modernize very slowly. But as China becomes a bigger and bigger economy. We need to remember in 1972, the Chinese economy is nowhere close to what it is today. Sure, it's bigger than Mexico's, but that's mostly because the population is so much larger. at a per capita level, there is just no point of comparison. Mexico is a lot richer, which is crazy to think of, right? China is an irrelevant country, as a lot of people, and that makes it relevant. But economically, it's not a relevant country. But as we know, throughout the 80s and 90s, China begins to grow and grow and grow. And of course, the Mexican presidents throughout realize that they need to have a relationship with China. However, I don't think anyone would have said in 1972 that China was going to grow the way that it grew, and that it would be not only an option or an interesting strategic idea to have a relationship with China, but an absolute necessity.
I think this is an interesting point in which we can all diss economists, because economists often base their analysis, rightly so in some respects, on precedent. And what happened in China is unprecedented. But the amount of condescension towards China before the year 2000, when growth really takes off and it becomes undeniable that China is on its way to become an economic world power, it's just the fact that it was seen as impossible for China to develop. It had too many people. It was too poor. It was too unwieldy. It was too unorganized. And therefore, it was impossible for a country like China to develop. It was almost used as an example, right? And now it's sort of the opposite, right? It was obvious that China was going to become a great power because of its people, because of its resources, because of its centralized government. And I always think it's interesting to point back at these sort of historical references to China before the 20th century, because if you followed precedent of the previous 100 years or so, or 200 years, maybe you were probably right. But the thing is, China sort of turned that game around and people didn't expect it. So as you say, Tavo, I think with the benefit of hindsight, a lot of people say, well, obviously you had to create X or Y sort of relationship with China because of its ascendancy. But it wasn't obvious at the time. And in fact, I think through a lot of these racist anti-Chinese tropes inherited throughout the 19th and 20th century, it was seen as almost impossible.
Certainly. And also, it makes absolutely no sense, right? Because when you look at the history of China, China's been nothing but exceptionally rich and powerful its entire history, except for what they call the 100-year humiliation, right? It kind of made sense that they would come back. But at the time, as you say, economists did not think so. And the joke's on them.
So we arrive at the 21st century, and two crucial things happen at this moment. The first is probably the most important one. China joins the World Trade Organization, opening the doors of the world economy to China, which at the time was seen as a victory over China. The Chinese were now playing by the liberal games. The post-Cold War regime had triumphed, and the fact that the largest communist country in the world was joining meant a triumph for liberal democracy. Also, the Clinton technocrats thought.
Once again, the joke's on them.
Exactly right. We'll get into the weeds as to what happened between the Chinese and the Mexican economy during that era in the next episode, part 2 of this podcast on China's influence on Mexico. But first, focusing on the political and social side of things, Mexico also had a transition at the time, which was its transition towards democracy, which opened up its borders further. Mexico also liberalized, but also the politicking of the 21st century made, I think, policy in regards to China slightly less sophisticated than the one-party state. One-party states can sort of have sort of rigid, almost academic positions when it comes to world relations, and that was something the PRI was very well known for. But as we've discussed, the PAN, the right-wing party, very democratic in its assent, but also very much in touch with its less cultivated roots in the form of Vicente Fox. This is the age in which we get 3 strands of Chinese-Mexican relationships developing. Number one is the sort of classic trade relationship that we get between Mexico and China. That actually was still in its infancy at the time. More importantly, though, we start to see the rise of the transnational narcotics organization, cartels. And the uses of Chinese citizens in these organizations started to evolve in fascinating ways. Not because they were Chinese. I think there was a lot of focus on Chinese cartel relationships because of this history of suspicion. But it had direct consequences in Mexico. Number one being the implementation of a Mexican nationality test after a Chinese citizen was arrested and found to have been naturalized as a Mexican with basically no knowledge of Spanish or of Mexico. It was so easy to become Mexican back then. And so they instituted a Mexican nationality test after this Chinese person was found to have been Mexican. I'm sure you could have found a number of Latin American, European, and American criminals with similar stories, but I do feel that it was because he was Chinese that the uproar came about.
Now, despite that ongoing prejudice, that I think it's safe to say still very much exists in many parts of the country today, relations between China and Mexico have continued to grow, and that includes Mexican presidents who have really openly tried to court the Chinese government. We've talked about every president from Echeverria all the way up to and including Enrique Peña Nieto visiting China as part of a state visit. Now, what's interesting is most presidents only visited once, a few visited twice, but what's special about Peña Nieto, who's in office from 2012 to 2018, is that he visited 4 times. And in that context, in 2013, they together decided to change or upgrade their relationship to what they called a comprehensive strategic partnership. Now,
yes, of course.
I have no idea what that means, but it was supposed to show that they weren't just friends; they were now very good friends, which I think signals, the change in tune of the Mexican government to not just like, okay, we'll recognize that you exist, to like, please, can we be buddies?
And it's such a classic story, this one. The President Peña Nieto relationship with China almost exists as a microcosm of the failures of the entire presidency at that time. Peña Nieto, a member of the PRI, which had returned after kicking out the right-wing PAN, and they create this relationship with China because they realize they're falling behind. They're not keeping up with Chinese development, and so they want to get closer to the winner. And so one of the big things is the idea that they'd want to bring Chinese investment into Mexico. At the time, there was no worries because obviously we still lived in the middle of this liberal mirage in which any investment was good investment. And so they courted Chinese investment, namely in the transport sector and specifically for trains. Long before Claudia Sheinbaum launched her Trains for Everyone policy, Enrique Peña Nieto was around to start his own train policy, which failed miserably. It failed to such an extent that I rode Enrique Peña Nieto's train for the first time this week after 12 years of it being under construction. And so, of course, Claudia Sheinbaum now gets to put on now Claudia Sheinbaum gets to take credit for it. But it was a long time in the making, but at least it got done. The Peña Nieto government was well known for its initial great optimism, technocratic good feelings, and promise that everything would change now that they were back in power because they were the good guys. They knew how to grow the Mexican economy, and for its enormous corruption. And so what we had in Mexico at the time, a troubled democratic country, was a deeply corrupt government in a system that had quite a few checks and balances by that point. And what did that result in? That resulted in the discovery of massive corruption in the train that was going to connect Mexico City, the great financial center of the country, to Querétaro, the capital, or one of the great capitals of El Bajío, one of the great industrial centers of the country. It was going to connect these 2 points, and it was a Chinese concession. It was given to Chinese companies to build. And when corruption was found in that project, it was cancelled. And the Chinese at that moment said, no more dealings with Mexico. Investment will not be prioritized because Mexico is not to be trusted. And weirdly, that one specific trip up defined the rest of the Mexico-China relationship, economically speaking, till our days. We'll get into exactly why and how, but the fact that Chinese investment ceased to be a relevant story in Mexico, but trade with China increasingly became important, has more or less determined not only the Mexico-China relationship, but also the United States relationship with China, which arguably is one of the most, if not the most important relationships on Earth. And definitely that triangular relationship, the Mexico-China-US relationship, is by far the most important trilateral relationship on the planet. I'm sorry, Canada.
Now, you say that moment, the Mexico-Querétaro train screw up, as your notes very eloquently say, defined the relationship for the country, between these two countries ever since. But I think there is one instance that is particularly relevant, and that also begins to mark the relationship, in this sense, in a positive way. And you said before, back in 2012, doing dealings with the Chinese government wasn't really a problem because we still lived in the liberal world of trade. All trade is good. In that time, we still lived also in a time where the United States was the unequivocal supreme leader of the world, right? But something happens in 2016, the election of President Trump, right? It's the moment, it's the official marker, I'm willing to bet, of the future's history books, of when it all changed for the whole world. President Donald Trump is elected for the first time, and he's elected on rambling, let's call it policies of China is the devil and Mexico is, I quote, they're not sending their best, right? These two countries with whom the US had relations and had always, at least for a very long time, been civil relations, in the words of the president-elect, are now secondary relations to be really concerned about. And it's in that context that Mexico and China say publicly that they both are committing to deepening their relation in the years to come.
Whether that's true or not is something we'll be discussing next time in part 2 of this 2-part series on Chinese influence in Mexico.